Let's welcome in Eugene Kontorovich, who is a senior legal fellow at Advancing American Freedom. And Eugene, really powerful words from Secretary Marco Rubio.
Yeah, this is a really historic development. This is the first time the United States government has really made a determined effort to fight back against globalist international institutions that threaten American sovereignty. And it's a visionary statement. And hopefully we're going to see follow-through, because what we have to understand is these institutions are created to be absolutely resistant to any kind of accountability, right? They're like cockroaches. They're going to be around after everybody else. So it's really going to take some determined effort.
And so why has the United States historically refused to become a party to the ICC?
Yeah, that's an important point because it's been completely bipartisan. Republicans haven't liked it and Democrats haven't liked it. The reason is nobody trusts a foreign court with judges not picked by Americans to prosecute Americans for offenses which are often broadly defined, and a lot of people can have different opinions about. Who would want American troops to be prosecuted by foreign officials? And in fact, we've already seen that the court has made a lot of very questionable determinations, and it's kind of like a global independent council. So America has the rule of law. You know, if American troops do commit war crimes, we investigate and we prosecute. And the only point of the ICC is to second-guess the judgment of American judges.
And so globalism, why would any sovereign nation agree to be part of the ICC?
So most of the countries who have joined the ICC are countries that are very unlikely to ever have to deal with it because they don't engage in militarized conflict, right? That is to say, Europe is the biggest fan of the ICC, Canada. And the biggest predictor of not joining the ICC is the likelihood to be engaged in wars. So America hasn't joined and Israel hasn't joined. The Arab countries haven't joined. India and Pakistan haven't joined. China hasn't joined. So anyway, if you think you're going to be militarily active, then you risk exposure to the ICC. The one exception is African countries who have joined and have, had some of their leaders brought before the ICC. That's because Europe essentially pays poorer countries to join the ICC because this is one of their kind of central beliefs.
And that makes a lot of sense that that countries wouldn't want these unelected global arbiters to enforce some kind of new global law and second guess our or their military action. And so the ICC, though, has pursued cases involving Israeli leaders. And I mentioned off the top what Mamdani is asking for the United States to essentially turn over Netanyahu to the ICC. So Rubio is signaling that defending American sovereignty also means defending the sovereignty of allies like Israel.
Yeah, absolutely. The case involving Israel is perhaps the most bogus and absurd thing the ICC has ever done. For one, the ICC only has jurisdiction over countries that have joined. Israel never joined. So the ICC invented the state of Palestine, not a UN member, not recognized by the United States, pretends it's a country, and uses that to prosecute Israeli officials. And the crime for which these warrants were issued never occurred. Right? It's a crime. They accused Netanyahu of starving the people of Gaza. But now that the war has ended, we see there are, in fact, no starving people, let alone people starved on purpose by Israel, which, of course, did not control food distribution in Gaza. That was Hamas. So it's a made-up country and a made-up crime. But the idea is to use it as a vehicle, as a tool, as a talking point for demonizing Israel and giving, food for fodder to people like Mamdani. I feel almost bad talking about the New York mayor's claims to try to arrest Netanyahu because they're so ridiculous. They're so far from happening. It's purely just attention-seeking behavior by him and playing to his base. But we see he's more interested in prosecuting Jews on the other side of the world for things that didn't happen, than cracking down on the real crime in his own city. He doesn't have enough crime in his own city.
Right. And yeah, well, it doesn't seem like he's making a lot of good decisions in the best interests of New Yorkers, but clearly he's been trying to become more of a national politician instead of actually focusing on what, unfortunately, the people of New York elected him, but did elect him to do. And this speaks, though, to a broader move by the Democrats who've been pushing for decades for globalism. And there's always been this tension between the call to maintain sovereignty in a variety of contexts, including declining to be part of the ICC, but then the rise of globalism. And so, how should conservatives understand the broader issues at stake here when we're talking specifically about things like the ICC, but even things like we've mentioned on this program before, the International Convention on Rights of the Child, and not undermining parental rights and giving over any of our national sovereignty for arbitration of fundamental rights?
Yeah, so one of the tenets of progressive ideology is that countries, religions, have all been nationalities, have all been part of the problem historically, and that we're moving towards a new world, a John Lennon imagined world with no countries and no borders. And Europe, which is at the center of this, they have decided to basically dismantle their countries, in favor of the European Union. They have abandoned their religions. And we see that when people abandon religion, they don't just believe in anything. They need something new to believe in. And this globalism, is part of that religion. The ICC has only convicted in its 25 years 6 people, and not very high-ranking ones. So why the obsession of it? Why are they so obsessed with the ICC? The answer is, I call it the last established church of Europe. This is some kind of a messianic vision that they have, and it results in international bureaucrats making decisions instead of national leaders, and those decisions are going to be almost inevitably things conservatives don't like.
Yeah, and it never works in the favor of conservatism because, as Marco Rubio mentioned and took us back to the Declaration of Independence that says governments derive their just powers from the consent of the governed, international courts can never satisfy that principle or that worldview. But who actually determines who sits on the ICC? I mean, who's actually behind this court?
So it's kind of like the United Nations. That is to say, it's not every country is a member, but 100 countries are members, or a bit less maybe. And basically, they all get together, and they're diplomats from 100 countries together pick the judges. So the connection from the democratic process of any one country to the judges is extremely attenuated, and there's really no way to fire or remove them by individual countries. So they are essentially unaccountable. Right? I don't think a single person in any of the member states can name a single ICC judge. So that is not a recipe for accountability.
Yeah, not at all. I mean, at least with all of the backlash against our Supreme Court justices, at least most Americans, if they're paying attention, can at least name them and they know what's going on. But broadly speaking, if sovereignty is eroding or does erode incrementally through some of these international institutions, how would Americans first start to notice, and what should conservatives who, at least for most of our AFR family and our listening audience, they're very concerned about these issues and national sovereignty. So how would Americans notice, and what should they be paying attention to?
You're going to notice because these international institutions promote rules and policies which aren't binding themselves, but then get used by courts and domestic political actors to get bootstrapped into sounding like official. Like, people hear a lot about the International Court of Justice, right? The International Court of Justice is investigating Israel for genocide. Well, the International Court of Justice does a lot of crazy things, and they recently had a decision saying that all countries have an obligation to do everything they can to prevent climate change and must take positive measures. So basically opening the door to full-blown government control and socialism over everything. The way to avoid this is to start breaking up with these institutions. These institutions have had, a kind of halo effect because they're supposed to be doing nice things, and they're also very bureaucratic and non-transparent, so it's hard to tell what they're actually doing. Almost all international institutions, UN institutions at least, promote global climate change agendas, promote gender theory, and promote particularly radical and harmful anti-parent educational policies. The best thing America can do is break up with these organizations. We don't have to be members. We joined the UN in 1945 in a kind of fit of optimism, but there are many of these organizations we can be quitting. President Trump really has done more than any other president in quitting organizations like UNESCO and the World Health Organization, but there's a lot more to go. There's the International Organization on Migration, which promotes migration across borders and eroding national borders. So there's a lot more. There's a lot more to do. International Court of Justice, America is subject to its jurisdiction under a variety of treaties, all of which we can get out of, and it's very important to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where the Trump administration, I think specifically Marco Rubio and some who are paying attention to these things, it's encouraging to see their perspectives and to see such strong condemnation of the ICC and saying that America will never join and participate. But if the ICC claims the authority to prosecute Americans or even prosecute, for example, Netanyahu in a country who obviously Israel has never joined them, despite not actually joining the court, what's the limiting principle? I mean, if sovereignty can be overridden there, where does that stop?
Right. So the ICC is actually a real threat to America. I want to make that very clear. Because while America has not joined, the ICC defenders and the jurisprudence, they say, look, America has conducted various operations in countries that have joined, which gives the ICC jurisdiction. In particular, ICC advocates are very excited about the prospect of trying Trump administration officials, and maybe even President Trump, in the ICC for the attacks on drug boats in the Caribbean, and even for the repatriation of illegal immigrants to Latin America, which they describe as a crime against humanity. Now, how would that work if America is not a member? Well, they would wait until after President Trump leaves office, and you have a President, Gavin Newsom. And then when, President Trump or Stephen Miller are traveling abroad, they would potentially face arrest. And the danger is that Gavin Newsom would, in a sense, abet this by not using the power of America to stop it. In other words, it's a way, the ICC provides hostile domestic, the opposition essentially, with a way of taking out their political opponents, and we've seen that happen already in other democratic countries, where a new government turns over its political opponents and predecessors to the ICC. Now, the Democrats have gotten President Trump tried in state court, in federal court, in the Senate. They have nowhere else to go but the ICC. And it's hard to imagine that they would blush about doing that.
That is a really scary proposition. And while so many Americans are focused on potential forthcoming indictments if Democrats get control of the House and or the Senate after the midterms and focusing on that, we do need to be focused on the ICC. And so just hypothetically, and last question for you as we're almost up against the break, Eugene, really appreciate your time this morning. If hypothetically that were to happen under a future Democrat president who, would turn over Trump or members of his administration to the ICC, does that become, in a sense, precedent that the ICC could use against America and say, well, since you have complied with our jurisdiction previously, even though you haven't overtly joined the ICC, you have recognized our jurisdictional authority over you?
Yeah, just because I don't think any American president would hand over U.S. officials. What they would do is not stop them from being arrested in foreign countries. And I think until recently, it was clear that any American president, would have to go to war, essentially, to free Americans arrested by the ICC. But with the increasing polarization, that all bets are off. But I think, President Gavin Newsom would be quite calm and comfortable in understanding that this would be used against Trump, who has a more aggressive foreign policy, and would not be used against him, because he's not going to be attacking drug boats in the Caribbean, and he's not going to be deporting people back to Central America.
Wow. Well, we have to take a break here, but Eugene Kontorovich, really appreciate your breakdown of the threat to national sovereignty